Yeah, I mean, I think you're giving the developers a lot of credit where they haven't really deserved it. A lot of developers are sort of like fart huffers, fart sniffers, where they're like, oh shit, we're so good. We're working at Blizzard, man. We're making epic games. And so I don't really know if they do much. Like, I'm sure they do some focus marketing because their marketing budget is usually more in excess of, or at least parity to, the actual game budget. It's like one of the reasons why the original StarCraft 2 costed so much money is because they had to dethrone Brood War. And part of the marketing budget was undoubtedly spent on killing Brood War esports. Because that's a sign of a competitive game, guys. Not a competitive product. Not even like you're playing the game as a competitive player. No, the game is competing as a product in a marketplace fairly. And you can tell that because Blizzard fucking killed Brood War esports for a time. Because they knew they couldn't compete, or they were scared and paranoid that they couldn't compete. You know what I mean? Like, that's kind of like, they mask off. They're showing their true colors immediately when they do that. By the way, true colors, the fifth mission of the Brood War Zerg campaign. Aha. See, unlike somebody who says that you need 3 High Templar to make an Archon, like the StarCraft 2 developers do, I actually know what Brood War is. I have played the game before. Killing previous games, preventing market cannibalization in the industry. Wouldn't it be the opposite, though? It's like StarCraft 2, I have a clip on my channel called StarCraft 2 is a cargo cult. And what that basically means is that StarCraft 2 tried to be as successful as Brood War without understanding what Brood War was and what made Brood War successful. And what of that is even possible to replicate, because some of it was like, the leading country that made Brood War as successful as it was South Korea. And it was emerging into a world where they had really good internet, and everybody was playing in LAN cafes, and a bunch of other aspects of their currency and their financial status. You don't have another example of a country like that. And even if you did, I don't think you should be courting like countries that are recovering from a fucking war so that your game can succeed. So even if you could somehow engineer that, it's pretty wild, man. There's a lot of StarCraft 1 was lightning in a bottle, and basically StarCraft 2 developers didn't understand that was even true. They perceived that they could actually redo all of it. Maybe it wasn't the developers, maybe it was the marketers. Somebody in the higher-ups of Blizzard thought that they could recapture the essence of StarCraft, make it even better, make it more successful, and instead we got a worse game that was, like, as far as I'm concerned, not even a quarter of what Brood War is. And I'm not even somebody who thinks Brood War is like the most epic thing ever. Right now, it's the best RTS we've had, but our whole mission statement is to make something better. And it does seem like a lot of other people have tried to make good RTS games. They usually just fall on their face. I don't even know if StarCraft 2 was an actual honest attempt at making a good RTS game, because they made so many boneheaded decisions along the way, and so many things from their lead developers like Dustin Browder. You look at interviews of these people, and some of their comments are so confusing and obviously not grounded in reality. Like, Dustin Browder is quoted as saying that like death balls are something they can fix with statistics. And that is, if that is true, the level of meddling you would have to do on a statistical level where unit stats would have to be modified and butchered is so extreme. You would have such a completely different game at the end of the day, if that's what you were using to fix the deathballing problem. The deathballing problem is first and foremost a pathfinding issue, and it's the fact that units just naturally want to clump together, and that there is no real sense of like individual unit pathways. That's the main problem. And StarCraft 2 developers never seem to even tweak the pathfinding, never seem to even acknowledge that it might have been the root cause of the issue, when, as far as I'm concerned as a game designer, that is completely obvious and transparent when you look at the game now and you actually see how the units behave. It doesn't matter what unit it is. It could be an Ultralisk or a Zergwing. They all do the same kind of thing. They push each other around and they, wiggle and they clump up into a ball. And, they did some things. They were aware of some things, because air units don't need to collide with each other, but as soon as they stop moving, they all burst out immediately. And you can see this with clumps of Mutalisks, for example. It's really obvious to see that they just immediately like decollide and push each other out so that they're spread out as they're respecting their collision boxes, basically. Brood War did this very slowly, and they actually didn't care if they were like overlapping that much necessarily. At least the collision boxes do cause some displacement, but it's much slower. So StarCraft 2 developers knew that they needed to make some changes to the formula somehow, but they didn't know, like, that's where they stopped, like they didn't really go any deeper than that. And apparently they didn't really change too much about pathfinding down the years either. StarCraft 2 is accessible to beginners. It's I'm not really sure that accessible to beginners is a good way to describe StarCraft 2. It depends on what you're trying to get out of it. Are you trying to inculcate people into the idea that RTS is a fun genre and it's really rewarding and deeply beneficial? During its lifespan, the bulk of its lifespan, StarCraft 2 received a lot of balance updates, which meant that if you didn't spend a lot of time reading patch notes and then watching some supportive content, which most of it, like, people are looking at League of Legends now, and there's a huge community of people who play League of Legends. And in that community, a lot of people are building videos, making content that explains the ramifications of patches. StarCraft 2 didn't have that nearly as widespread for most of its lifespan. Legacy of the Void and maybe a later area of Heart of the Swarm did start to see that come up more often. But StarCraft 2 received so many balance updates that invalidated player experience and skills that they learned previously. So what you would do is, as a player trying to compete within the game, you would pick up some stuff and you would say, okay, I'm going to learn Terran. And, oh, there's, they added the Banshee's like one of these harassment units or whatever. Oh, the Banshee gets reworked a million times. Oh, the bunker has its time cost changed dramatically over its lifespan, where it's like 40 seconds, 30 seconds, 40 seconds, 30 seconds, 35 seconds, split the difference, back to 40 seconds. Like, the barracks also in the same way. Like, they were trying to fine-tune all of this balancing stuff, but they were doing so in a way that would, in some ways, dramatically invalidate what the players had learned before. I think that's much worse for beginner players. Because at least in Brood War, yes, beginner players will have a harder time if they've never played an RTS before, but they don't have to worry about what skills they are learning being completely invalidated by a balance update. Maybe if you're just trying to play on competitive ladder, the map pools will do something like that because some map pool changes will happen. But even those, like, Brood War players are complaining that map pool changes don't happen enough because I think it's like once a year or something. I haven't looked into that because I don't care about remastered. But like that's a case where their skills will remain consistent. Assuming they're learning the right skills, those skills will remain consistent. And in an era where there's so much content out there for them to learn, really it's up to them if they want to be competitive enough to do that. Now, you could criticize Brood War for not having like first-party tutorial content and how like the campaigns teach you terrible lessons that under no circumstances you should bring over to multiplayer because like all of the maps start out with all of the map under the control of the enemy, and then you have to grind through all this pre-play stuff. So you're basically educated to sit in your base, build up a death ball of 200 units or like, a bunch of battle cruisers or whatever, and then just like a move across the whole map, and then you're done. Trying to do that in an actual melee game against a human player would result in death immediately because you would just not be able to do any of the same things. So you could criticize Brood War for not having good onboarding between, like, for new players to go into multiplayer. And apparently Age of Empires 2 has tried to do the opposite of this, where they have a bunch of, like, first-party tutorials that are basically, like, downstream of concepts that everybody uses in multiplayer, right? It would be the equivalent of if you fired up Brood War and you played an official single-player map that taught you how, like, the timing of when to expand or the optimal, like, mineral saturation level or, elements of the game, like, if you move workers to your second base, you'll get more value out of them than if they stay at your first base. So you should try to transfer like 4 to 5 workers or whatever you have. And like, certain build orders maybe that are like evergreen that always seem to be working, like Forge, Fast, Expand for Protoss. If you could teach them that kind of stuff, that would basically be what I'm talking about. So that would give them somewhat of a leg up. But I mean, StarCraft 2 doesn't really have that either. And they couldn't make something like that because the build orders kept changing over time because the game state kept changing over time. There was no evergreen build order really. I'm sure there were some examples, like the depot used to be a requirement for the barracks, so I can't even say that, because you could do like, oh yeah, do a barracks and then a depot, or some people would do depot and then barracks, but then for a while you had to do it, and now I don't even know what it is. If we go back to like the pathing specifically stuff, like I agree that is bad, but if you just look at most units, like you think of the Marine or the Zergling, I think if you just move those units around, you will actually get a more natural and better solution than if you're moving StarCraft 2 units around. StarCraft 2 is more consistent because it doesn't have as many edge cases. If you have a flat map and you take 10 Marines in StarCraft 1 and 10 Marines in StarCraft 2 and you right-click the same amount of distance roughly, you will get dramatically different results because the StarCraft 2 units will clump up. So it's true that you won't have to worry about spam clicking units up a ramp. But basically the way that they achieved that is to the detriment of everything else. So I would take Brood War pathing any day, even though it has a lot of faults. There are things you can do to improve it. Fundamentally, you will need some sort of different architecture for pathing, I think. But it's not a million miles away from what is ideal, or at least the most ideal that I've experienced. I got my little smiley face. Well, actually, you know what? I got a U. A U is better anyway. Give me that U. This is my U. Okay? So I have a U. If I right click, hopefully it works. Almost. Oh, there he is. The U stayed. Dude, it preserved the U. It's a little bit different, right? But this is a completely flat map. And this is an example of something you'll never see in StarCraft 2.